Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There is never a shortage of stories to follow across the national park system, whether you're in the West at Olympic National Park, the Northeast at Acadia National Park, or the Southwest at Grand Canyon National Park. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. This week, contributing editor Kim O'Connell has headed down to North Carolina to spend a few days at Cape Hatteras National Seashore, which has no shortage of news to report on, whether it's leatherback sea turtles nesting there, the restoration of Cape Hatteras Light, or the collapse of houses into the Atlantic Ocean at Rodanthe. Kim is working on a number of those stories for the Traveler, and we're going to check in with her today to learn what she's discovering. We'll be back in a minute with Kim.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
So hi, Kim. I understand you're down at Cape Hatteras this week.
I sure am, Kurt. Thanks so much. I'd like to check in with you.
There's so much going on across the national park system, but it seems like particularly at Cape Hatteras, I mean, they're restoring Cape Hatteras Light, that beautiful lighthouse that not too many years ago they had to move inland from the ocean because they were worried about it falling into the ocean. But what's going on now? What can you tell us about the lighthouse? I know they've got scaffolding all over it, and it just looks really cool, like a rocket ready to take off.
It really does. It's amazing. So first of all, it's really fun to be here on assignment for National Parks Traveler. I told a couple of friends that I was going down to the seashore for work, and they're pretty much like, yeah, right. I'm like, no, really, it's work. But there are worse places to be, of course, in July. But obviously, I was in a long line of cars to get down on Highway 12 to go down Cape Hatteras National Seashore, especially on July 4th week when we're recording this. And it was super busy. But my first destination, I should say, was the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. I have been coming to Cape Hatteras since I was a very little girl in the late 70s, actually. And that lighthouse has always held incredible fascination for me and for just everybody else who comes to the Outer Banks. And obviously, it's so well known because of its barber pole, day mark, as they call it, its paint job on the outside. But as you said, it now looks like the Saturn V rocket, which, some of us who remember the Apollo missions and remember what that looks like, a tall rocket covered in scaffolding, and that's exactly what it looks like. And it also reminds me of when the Washington Monument went through a restoration about 10 years ago and was completely covered in scaffolding. And it's just so surprising for us to see these iconic landmarks look so different and be, literally under construction in certain ways. It's a monumental effort. In fact, the company Scaffold Resource that did do the work at the Washington Monument, I think that was in 2013, is the same company that has now scaffolded the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse for this ongoing restoration that's happening there. And this has been going on since earlier this year, and it's expected to continue into, I think, fall of 2025. And it's a soup to nuts restoration. They are removing elements that have degraded over time, metalwork, bricks. They have removed elements that were added after the lighthouse was built so that it didn't quite look like it was when it was first built, not exactly historically accurate. And then they're restoring the lighthouse to make it better able to withstand the conditions down here, which are pretty severe in terms of salt spray and wind and storms and all those things. So it was pretty remarkable to see it.
Yeah. Now, there was no driving safety issue that prompted all this restoration work, was there? Or isn't this just somewhat routine maintenance and the Park Service wanting to, stay ahead of major problems?
I think that's it. They're definitely wanting to stay ahead of it, but this is a major effort. There's ongoing work that happens at the lighthouse all the time. They're always monitoring this big, beautiful historic structure that dates to the 1870s. But this is a big soup to nuts restoration. One of the major aspects that has a lot of history buffs excited about it, that I know the Traveler has mentioned and reported on, is that they're replacing the beacon, the light beacon that's been there for a long time, with a historically accurate replica of the original Fresnel lens that the lighthouse had. Now, it's not going to be sort of lanterns that are going to fuel the light. It's going to be an LED light inside the Fresnel lens. But there is an artisan named Dan Spinella, who's out of Florida, who, while the lighthouse is under restoration here in North Carolina, he's down in Florida just meticulously recreating the original first order Fresnel lens, which is a big piece of machinery that used to sit in the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. And he is one of the few experts there are in the United States who know how to create a Fresnel lens. So it's kind of a dying art. And, apparently he's trying to find apprentices to pass on this knowledge of what he's doing. So I think when that lens comes back, into the lighthouse, it's going to be a real cause for celebration, for those who care about the lighthouse and lighthouses and its history.
Now, I really love lighthouses, but I don't know too much about them. It wasn't too long ago that I learned about that day marking, that every lighthouse has its individual paint design, so to speak. You mentioned the Fresnel lens, and you said first order Fresnel lens. Do you know what that means?
I'm not super clear on that either. I imagine it has something to do with its power and its size, but I, again, am not a Fresnel lens expert, and I will have to look that up before I write about this for the Traveler for sure. So
We do like to
I
play
think if we're
stump the
just
guest.
pronouncing it correctly is good enough.
I'm always out there to stump the guest. So while this restoration is going on, are they allowing public tours, or is that impossible?
Yes, no, that's one of the remarkable things about it, because it is a construction zone. So I was there on a media tour. There were several of us there. And they did sort of let us into areas that the public isn't allowed to go into right now. But the light station area of Cape Hatteras down in Buxton, which is on the southern end of Hatteras Island, is open to visitors. You can go to the beach there. You can actually go into the original lightkeepers' quarters, where there's a small museum. They have preserved that access for visitors. And of course, there's chain link fencing around the major restoration area. So, visitors can get full view of this, rocket-like scaffolding structure. They're still taking a lot of pictures. And I think it's still really interesting for visitors to see, although I'm sure some people are sad to not have their iconic Cape Hatteras Lighthouse picture. But it is open to visitors. And in fact, they do a special education program every day. The Park Service does once a day for visitors that talk specifically about what's happening at the lighthouse. So people if they're curious about the restoration work, they do a talk every single day. So I think that's really cool that they're letting people know, what's happening with their lighthouse. And we did, while I was there on the media tour, we saw plenty of tourists there who are sort of stopping and eavesdropping and listening to what the park rangers were telling us. One thing that's interesting there is that they're completely redoing the landscape around the lighthouse. And that's another reason why a lot of it is fenced off to visitors. They're creating more historically accurate and also visible circulation paths. And they will be kind of going around a more native landscape of sea oats and other native vegetation that is going to be more historically accurate to what what was planted there when the lighthouse was built, but also as native plants, the idea is that it's also a more ecologically sound landscape as well. But right now it's all these little plants, looking like, like hair plugs or something in the landscape, and they're not quite robust yet. So I know they're trying to keep visitors off those areas while the plants are growing in. And I think the idea was before it was more of just a lawn between, the museum buildings, the outbuildings, and the lighthouse. And so people were just crisscrossing, creating a lot of social trails. And we see this a lot in various national parks places. So they're creating this beautiful, historically accurate circulation path, new paving. But the idea is also to make them so visible and so attractive that hopefully they'll still steer visitors onto them so that we don't have so much social trails happening around the lighthouse, and that will protect this new vegetation also. So that was neat to see.
Yeah, yeah. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the current location of the lighthouse is not where it was originally built. It was moved some years ago to get it away from erosion problems, eating away at the bluff. Do you recall how far they moved it, and is that pathway still visible today, that people can walk it and get the feel for how
They
far it was
certainly
moved?
can. Well, they can't walk the whole path now. I mean, it was a significant distance that I am not recalling off the top of my head right now. Um, but a significant distance back from the seashore, from the edge of the seashore. And that happened in 1999. So it's remarkable that that's been 25 years ago already. And that's actually one of the questions I asked on the media tour is, how are we doing? Was that a good, estimation as to how far back from the shore they needed to move it? And is the lighthouse in any danger at this point? And even though erosion is severe at the seashore, which we'll talk about, right now they're still well within their anticipated, protection zone for the lighthouse, and the actual edge of the ocean is really not any threat to the lighthouse. It probably won't be for a very, very long time. But with the way things are going at the seashore and along all our coasts, obviously there will be a point at some point in the future that no one can exactly predict, when I'm sure those waves are going to be lapping up against that lighthouse again. But
Yeah.
the superintendent and the other Park Service people that were there yesterday said that it wasn't going to happen anytime soon.
Good to know. Good to know. Now, you'd mentioned earlier that some people were disappointed that they couldn't get their iconic lighthouse photograph, but of course there are other lighthouses at Cape Hatteras. There's the Body Island Light, and what I think is the most picturesque light is the Ocracoke Lighthouse. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
that is a historic treasure.
It is. And what's really interesting there, I am heading down to Ocracoke probably later today to go visit also an iconic thing there, which is their herd of wild horses for another traveler article. But I also love the Ocracoke Lighthouse. It's the shortest of the three iconic Outer Banks lighthouses. I guess if you can include Cape Lookout as well. But for Hatteras, Cape Hatteras National Seashore, we have Body Island, Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and Ocracoke. And Ocracoke is the shortest. It's a shorter, white, fat lighthouse, and it's sort of nestled in a residential area, which makes it kind of interesting. It's really kind of part and parcel of that historic village, the fishing village down at the end of Ocracoke. But one thing I heard yesterday is that while it is significantly away from the shoreline on Ocracoke, Ocracoke's an even smaller, much smaller island than Hatteras, also facing its share of issues with erosion and sea level rise. It was battered by a hurricane a few years back. That lighthouse is really vulnerable. It's right there at sea level, and with the way things are going, it's also an at-risk structure that they're keeping a close eye on. So all these beautiful historic lighthouses at the seashore are areas of concern.
Yeah, and Ocracoke, I believe, is undergoing some restoration work of its own, along with the Keeper's House there. I believe they're elevating them a little bit, as well as doing, some other paint and, carpentry work where necessary. But no,
Yeah, I
it's
think so
good.
too. I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's good to see it, these iconic structures, whether it's a lighthouse or a keeper's house, that you go to a national seashore and you visit these places and you hold them in your memory. And it's good to see that the Park Service is taking good care of them. And, when you can come down a decade later and they're still there and they're still just as you remember them.
Oh yeah, I mean they're so incredibly special, and I particularly have always loved the kind of nexus of history and nature, which the national park system is so known for. I mean, I love when those things kind of butt up against each other. Of course, that whole thing between nature and culture, nature and people is kind of the root of a lot of our issues that come up at the national parks, but it also is a source of a lot of beauty and interest when they're
It
right
really,
there next to each other.
it really is, and with the National Seashore, there's so much change just because of natural elements and the ocean and storms and you know historic shipwrecks come to light and they disappear and all kinds of machinations on the landscape. It's really kind of a fascinating living landscape. So, Kim, among the stories that you're working on, of course, you've got the lighthouse there, and you've got the Ocracoke ponies. The Park Service is trying to figure out what to do with the ponies. And a bigger story, so to speak, is what's going on with sea level rise, more potent hurricanes. There's a hurricane now storming through the southern Caribbean of historic size for this time of year. And of course, at Cape Hatteras, we've got houses collapsing into the ocean at Rodanthe. And you've been able to talk to the superintendent, and you're going to be, getting more into detail on some of your stories down the road. But it's a major issue for the seashore there with what's going on.
Oh, it's so incredibly complicated. And I have to say that even knowing Cape Hatteras as well as I do, having come here many, many times, having followed the story of the collapsing houses, I think 5 or 6 houses have fallen into the sea in Rodanthe. It was astonishing to see it with my own eyes yesterday when I was there with the superintendent. The superintendent was kind enough to show me 2 different spots on Hatteras Island where erosion is a major, major issue and causing deep concern for these houses, these beach houses that are right up against the ocean now. And it's a constant conflict between letting a barrier island do what it's supposed to do. Barrier islands are meant to shift back and forth. That's the way they've always been. There's a constant conflict between letting Mother Nature do what it's meant to do and also maintaining access to these places. It's the perennial problem of the national park system. Like, how do we keep these places open and accessible for visitors and tourists and people that want to have second homes there or go vacation there, while also allowing these natural processes to happen, because it's kind of a losing battle in a way to keep fighting against the relentless ocean and the erosion. And also, we are dealing with major impacts from climate change. So these issues are happening faster and more furiously over time. So the superintendent and I did go to Rodanthe, and we did. He sort of showed me in the distance where houses had already fallen in, but we walked around a series of about 4 or 5 houses that are at risk of imminent collapse, and they are all empty of their residents. The homeowners are well aware that these homes are at serious risk. In some cases, you can already see them leaning, or you can see that parts of the house have already failed, and they could be washed out to sea at any moment. So one thing that I found really interesting was that when we first pulled up to this one site in Rodanthe where the erosion is particularly severe, I saw a series of black stumps in the sand. And I thought for sure that they were just pilings or maybe leftover, poles from the houses that had fallen in, but that was not the case. It was actually the uncovered remnant of what was once a sound side forest that has been uncovered by the vertical erosion, both the vertical and the horizontal erosion of the island. It was astonishing. So this is a forest that once stood on the protected side of these barrier islands, toward the sound side, the far western edge of these barrier islands. And then over time, the whole island has shifted westward so much that these long buried stumps of these trees, who knows when they once stood alive, have been uncovered now. And there's all this undercutting with this erosion that happens, and you can now see all these ragged black stumps of this old forest. It's just amazing to think, how much the island has shifted and how much it's still shifting. And there's your evidence right there. So that was a remarkable thing to see. The other remarkable thing to see there was all the septic tanks that have been uncovered by erosion from these houses. That's also obviously
Mhm.
made these houses unlivable. So this is a major hazard for the beach. So you have all these septic tanks that have long been emptied of their contents. They're just abandoned structures. It's just phenomenal to think that, this is what the park is dealing with down there. Just having this effluent and waste just floating out to into the ocean every time one of these houses collapses. So it was just incredibly mind-blowing and astonishing to think how quickly that we've gotten to this point.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I've seen pictures, obviously, that the Park Service has sent out of some of these recent collapses, and it looks like houses are lined up like dominoes along the coast there.
They are.
Any idea how many are at risk of falling in the coming months, if years?
Yeah, well, he said about 20 to 30 are at, imminent risk of danger or collapse, partial or total, and there's no way to predict, when that will happen. The thing that was really interesting yesterday was it was a very windy day when I was out there yesterday. So the waves were rolling. And Dave Halleck, the superintendent, estimated that maybe the waves were pushing in like maybe 2 miles an hour. And but they were like big white caps, and it was a very foamy sea. And the immense power of the ocean, it was just incredible to see that right up against the pilings of these houses. I mean, just like battering nonstop. And as Dave Halleck pointed out, he goes, "This is not a storm. This is just another day at Cape Hatteras. These are normal waves for us. Yeah, it's a little windy and choppy, but this is not a storm surge. This is not hurricane level winds." So when you think about climate change and increasingly severe storms, I mean, as quickly as these houses are going on normal storm days and in normal conditions, then you get increasing storms from climate change. If Hatteras gets a direct hit, like, it's just an incredibly vulnerable situation right now.
Yeah, it really is. Were you able to talk to any of the homeowners in the Rodanthe area?
I haven't yet. I mean, I was going to head back up that way while I'm down here and see if I could talk to some folks. But if not, while I'm here, I definitely would like to follow up with some homeowners and just get their take on what it's like. I think it's been really devastating because it's incredibly costly for homeowners to have to deal with this. They might have some sort of flood insurance, but no one really can prepare financially for the complete loss of these houses. One thing I know the Traveler has reported on previously is the pilot program that the Park Service has started, which with kind of a home buyout program where they've worked with the National Park Trust to actually buy some of these threatened houses at fair market value, so that they can safely demolish them and remove the threats, from the seashore. So I asked the superintendent whether that was expected to continue, and they're hoping to keep talking to the park trust and find ways to scale that up. I mean, they've just done that, I think, with 2 houses so far, but it's still like when you think about it, that's I think while that could be help the Park Service to better predict and manage house collapse situations, like it's also like, a big effort for them to be in the home buying business. It's not kind of what we think about when we think about what the Park Service should be doing. It's
Yeah.
not expected kind of management tools, but that's kind of the reality that they're facing right now.
Well, and it's a real conundrum as well because you said they're being purchased at fair market value. Somebody could argue that they have no fair market value because the ocean's going to reclaim them any moment now, and a homeowner might have insurance on the home, but they can't claim that insurance. They can't file for that insurance until the home collapses. And so the Park Service is in this untenable position where they basically have to sit and watch this home collapse and the septic tanks get ripped open and all the construction debris float down the coastline. Or they can try and buy these homes, and I don't know what the process is for determining fair market value on them. It's got to be a real headache for Dave Halleck and his staff.
I mean, he says that he does a lot of this negotiating work himself. I mean, this is what's taking up his days, and he's got a lot of park to manage on top of all that. So, I don't envy his job at all. It's incredibly complicated. I think they probably will have to create new rules because of this, like new policy around how you factor that stuff in when we're dealing with this kind of situation.
Yeah, yeah. And then not only do you have the problem with houses falling into the ocean, but Highway 12 that you drove down to get there, a major storm comes through and Highway 12 gets ripped up. And fortunately, it's not the Park Service's problem. It's Dare County's problem in the state of North Carolina, but it's a problem nonetheless. And, what's the answer there?
What's interesting to me, going back to what I said about having come to the Outer Banks since the late 70s, is just how much more engineering is visible on the landscape now than when, the sleepy old days, I sound like a dinosaur, the sleepy old days of the 70s when you could take Highway 12 from the Oregon Inlet all the way down to Hatteras without crossing, any other bridges. Now there's a shorter bridge that sort of goes over an area that was breached in a storm some years back. And then, of course, there's the big new Dug Handle Bridge that was built a few years back to kind of skirt around one of the, most vulnerable areas in Rodanthe. So it's just much more engineering and infrastructure is required to hold this island in place and to keep it accessible to visitors. And I did ask this sort of just thought exercise question to the superintendent, thinking about Mount Everest. And so go with me here, Kurt. Like one of the perennial things that you hear about with Mount Everest is that because of the human waste that's left on there, the incredible crowding of people trying to get to the top of that iconic mountain, there has been ongoing talks about whether the locals, the Sherpas, the Nepali government should just shut down Everest, at least for a year, to allow the mountain to recover from human impacts, like just close it off to climbers and other tourists so it can recover. And so I said to the superintendent, like, can you foresee like a day where Cape Hatteras, is no longer a place for humans, maybe? Like maybe it's not a place that we visit as tourists anymore because it just becomes untenable to access it. And he couldn't really answer that, obviously, but he did say that within the next 20, 50, or 100 years, Cape Hatteras is probably going to look very, very different. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, you raised some interesting points. Across the park system, we talk about crowding and impacts to natural resources. And some parks are nice and tidy, so to speak, compared to Cape Hatteras. I mean, you've got Yellowstone National Park. You've got Glacier National Park. There's no communities inside them. They're all national park lands. And at Cape Hatteras, you've got this mix, this patchwork of national seashore plus local communities. And you can't really control who comes down to Cape Hatteras. It's whatever the market will bear.
Right. And they each have their own relationship with the seashore. And Superintendent Halleck talked about that too. So I said, well, don't most people want to maintain the seashore in its wild or natural state with the least amount of engineering and infrastructure added? And he said, no, it depends who you ask. There's just too many different kinds of constituents down here. I mean, it's a really complicated place. I mean, I think the seashore is really interesting for that same reason, because if they can figure it out, that might point a way forward for all our coastal parks, because they're so highly visited and highly visible. People are really paying attention to Cape Hatteras. So if they can sort of figure out how to deal with some of these issues, it might be really instructive for some other seashores and lake shores. But yeah, it's really complicated, and everybody feels a lot of ownership over the seashore, like the locals, the tourists, the park service, the people that work there, serve the tourism industry. There's just so many people, and they all have their own relationship and strong feelings about it. So it's really complicated.
Yeah, it is. And at the same time, you kind of have a control situation right down the coast at Cape Lookout National Seashore, where you've got 3 barrier islands, and hurricanes come through, and the storm surges. There was one a couple of years ago where it created 50 breaches in Cape Lookout, and the Park Service just sat back and watched them, and most of the breaches closed. And you can't imagine something like that happen at Cape Hatteras just because of the built-up communities and infrastructure.
Yeah. It's interesting to ponder whether Cape Hatteras will look more like Cape Lookout someday. I'm not sure.
Or just get washed away.
It's possible.
Now, another story you're going to look into while you're down there. You mentioned them earlier, the Ocracoke ponies, beloved by many, but do they belong there? Are they a natural element of the national seashore of the Outer Banks of North Carolina? Another tough position that the superintendent and his staff are placed in, deciding, do we keep them or do we not keep them? I think there's only like, what, 9 or 10 ponies, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fluctuating population, but it's not very many, strictly speaking, yet they're a major force in people's imagination when they think about Cape Hatteras. So it's another beloved aspect of the seashore that people feel a lot of ownership over. There's something incredible about seeing horses when you're down at the beach and imagining kind of like, a Spanish ship from 500 years ago, kind of like the myths that we've all read about with these horses. But there's myths and then there's reality. And the reality is that these are not strictly native, horses. They're not native to this landscape. The Park Service has been dealing with them for a long time, and now they've gained a lot of affection with the visiting public. But especially in light of all these other threats and issues that the park is dealing with, they're now also considering, like, what is our responsibility here to this herd of horses that don't really have a historic precedent or reason to be here. One thing that people may or may not know, who aren't familiar with Cape Hatteras, is that for a while in the 20th century, the Boy Scouts were in charge of the herd at Ocracoke because the herd was there. People again weren't really sure what to do about them. Should we protect them, pen them, let them go free? They were causing issues and eating vegetation and things. And so for a while, the local Boy Scout troop on Ocracoke took care of the ponies, but that didn't last forever because, I guess goals and management changes. And at some point, the Park Service took over responsibility again. But I think it's an interesting time again, just considering the variety of interests at the seashore and the different feelings that people have about what should be done there. So it'll be curious to see what happens.
Aren't they kept in a pen, so to speak?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. So it's not like what you would see. There are wild horse herds that you might see running on the beach in the northern part of the Outer Banks. Of course, people have heard about the horses of Assateague, which are visible and live in a more wild state. But even the word wild is something that the Park Service is wrestling with because they're sort of wild, yet they're penned. Are they really wild? Are they feral? Should we consider them, wildlife, or should we consider them livestock? It's just interesting. Even the terminology is kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and you go down to Cumberland Island National Seashore, and they have feral horses, and I don't think they're banker horses. They're not descended from Spanish galleons that were sunk offshore. If my memory serves correct, there used to be some agricultural practices on Cumberland Island, and that's where the horses came from. When the farmers left, they didn't want to take their livestock, so they just let it go free. But the Park Service has this, frankly, tremendous problem dealing with horses across the park system. We had the very visible national case of, does Theodore Roosevelt National Park want to hold on to its feral horses? They're not wild horses; they're feral horses. And the Park Service kind of backed down in the face of public opposition. The governor wrote to him. I think the congressman wrote to him, "Please leave our horses there. They're a remnant of Teddy Roosevelt's days in the late 1800s." And you've got the horses at Cumberland Island, where it's almost 180 degrees different from at Theodore Roosevelt. It seems like most of the people want the horses removed for the horses' welfare, and because of what they're doing to the natural resources there, with their excrement and trampling on sea turtle nests and piping plover nests, and it's just a mess.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the park system is it is so incredibly diverse. And so you can't have a one size fits all approach to park management. I mean, that's what makes it interesting, what makes it difficult, I think, because the issues at each place, while they kind of fit into an overall category, they're still so hyper local and hyper specific. It's kind of hard to deal with. But obviously, these parks will, I'm sure, are talking to each other. There's, I'm sure, a lot of engagement with different groups about how to deal with these herds. I mean, horses have such a hold on the American imagination. It's, hard to consider getting rid of the horses. That's a tough campaign to argue against, But it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's crazy. Now, you mentioned you've been going to Cape Hatteras for decades. I'll be curious. Can you compare then and now? I mean, the National Seashore has seen rocketing visitation since the COVID broke out in 2020. What's it like compared to when you first visited?
I mean, it's always been popular, but my dad, who's not living anymore, but he used to say that we loved the Outer Banks before it was OBX, is what he used to say, which is not exactly true because that name has been around. OBX as an abbreviation has been around for a long time. But the idea was that we did start going there well before sort of current boom times in visitation. And what I remember most is how modest the beach cottages used to be when I was much younger. It was much more of like your 1 and 2 bedroom houses. And now, everything's gotten fancier and bigger because population has grown and the visiting population has grown. So not only do you have just much more people coming, even the houses here, the beach, when you go through the beach towns, all the houses are so much bigger. And that kind of goes into kind of what's at risk when we have a shifting sands and a threatened coastline. It's just way more infrastructure, way more development. Just the tax base at the Outer Banks is just tremendously bigger than it used to be. Is just remarkable to see those changes. There's a little store in Salvo, which is one of the little towns on Hatteras Island, called the Blue Whale, which has been there since forever. And since I was a very little girl, I used to go buy my Archie comics there, and it's holding on as a mom and pop enterprise. But you get all these beach box stores are coming in. It's like the equivalent of a big Kmart or something or a Target, but the big beach box stores. There's a lot of visitation pressure on this island and on this seashore. It's really amazing to see. Traffic is nonstop, basically. It used to be that your bad traffic days were like Saturday or Sunday, where people are going on and off the island, and that is still true. But what I'm seeing on Highway 12 is just getting on Highway 12 any time of day, on any given day, you're going to face a long line of cars because there are just so many people down here.
Wow, wow. That's unfortunate. I mean, the personality of some of these coastal towns, from the 60s or the 50s, even in the 70s, and it is being taken over by these megaplexes, and it's unfortunate.
But at the same time, we want people to experience their national park system. So I think it's a tension that, we cover the park system and we love the parks and we want other people to love the parks. And I know that the Traveler has often tried to get folks to try out other parks that are lesser known, to relieve some of the pressure on the best known places. But, these places get a lot of visitation because they are so amazing. So, it's like, on one hand, I can't begrudge people for wanting to come to the beloved Cape Hatteras because I want to come here too. So, but it's tough. Yeah.
It really is, and it's tough to manage them. And kudos to Dave Halleck and his staff. Well, Kim, it's been great catching up with you on your hard work assignment down there on the Outer Banks. Make sure you eat some crab for me, please.
I'll try.
That's contributing editor Kim O'Connell. She's spending a few days down at Cape Hatteras National Seashore, catching up on some stories that I think you'll find interesting in the weeks ahead. Kim, thanks again. Have a great time.
Thanks so much, Kurt. Talk to you soon.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. If you know of a story or stories that the Traveler should consider, please drop us a line at news@nationalparkstraveler.org. Unfortunately, while we can't cover everything that's going on across the more than 400 units of the National Park System, we like to tackle as much as we can. For the Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.